If you've been watching my videos long enough, you'll probably have a good idea of just how active the Earth is. Nothing stays the same for long here, and even the smallest changes in something like temperature can have drastic impacts all across the planet's surface. Of course, over the last few hundred years, much of the change the Earth has been experiencing has been the direct result of man-made factors. You know, global warming, carbon emissions, greenhouse gases. We've all heard this story before. Oh my God, Mia, what do you want? What? What is it? No, come on, I gotta... Come on, Mia. Let's go. Sit on my lap then. Come here. Just sit here. Yeah, okay. Okay, there we go. But looking even further back, over the past 300,000 years, or roughly how long modern humans have been around, we can see the Earth's average temperature has varied significantly, going through periodic sharp increases followed by more gradual dips back into the cold. While these natural changes shouldn't be confused with the anthropogenic climate change we're witnessing today, which is both far more rapid and far more severe, at the very least the effects of changing temperatures were the same back then as they are now. Each of these peaks and troughs was accompanied by a subsequent rise and fall in the sea level, temporarily revealing lands lying just marginally below the surface, only to have them inevitably fall back under the water as soon as the trend reversed. This cycle of ebbing and flowing means that we as a species have witnessed islands emerge from the ocean long enough for them to become homes for sizable populations, only to eventually become lost again generations later, taking with them any and all relics we might have left behind. Sitting at times just inches beneath the water's surface, these sunken lands serve not only as lessons on the geologic past, but can also offer us glimpses into the world as our distant ancestors knew it. And so today we're hunting down some of these lost islands to see what they can reveal about our own history. Okay, so before I get started, I just wanted to say that a while back I made a pretty similar video to this one called Earth's Lost Continents, where I looked at many of these strange and often ignored continental fragments sitting on the ocean floor. The major difference between those and what we're talking about today is that most of the lost continents never actually rose above the ocean, whereas now I'm specifically looking at places we know were in fact dry land at some point during human history. Now on that video, the single comment I got more than any other was people upset that I left out Doggerland, a part of Northern Europe that as recently as 8,000 years ago stood above what's now the North Sea. But what all these people commenting didn't understand was that Doggerland isn't an actual landmass in its own right, but rather is simply a feature of the much larger Eurasian continental shelf. Or in short, it just didn't make any sense to talk about it in that video. But this isn't Earth's lost continents, it's Earth's lost islands. So yes, it's finally time to talk about Doggerland. Checking back to this graph, we'll see that 18,000 years ago, global temperatures and by extension sea levels reached their most recent low. Consequently, global ice sheets extended their furthest, ushering in a period called the last glacial maximum. At this time, glaciers covered much of the northern hemisphere, burying most of Europe, including Doggerland, under several miles of ice. If you're curious about what the Earth looked like at this time, then guess what? I made a whole other video on that already. And so to see these lands actually exposed, we need to fast forward to after temperatures started to rise again as the ice sheets began to recede. In their wake, the retreating glaciers deposited huge quantities of rocky material they had picked up along the way into what's called a moraine, building an area of Doggerland up above the rest into what's now called Dogger Bank. What would have for a time appeared as a series of low hills in an otherwise flat landscape. At the same time, Europe was receiving many of its first inhabitants who would have found this flat, grassy area to be a more than suitable place to live, where mammoths, woolly rhinoceros, lions, and other grassland megafauna roamed, resembling an environment not too different from the savannas of Africa they'd originated from. But as glaciers continued to recede, these flat, low-lying lands were some of the first to become inundated with ocean water, leaving only the local highlands of Dogger Bank intact by around 6000 BCE, trapping whatever people and animals had made their way here prior to this. For a time, these hills survived as a sizable island smack dab in the middle of the newly formed North Sea, a doomed land that would have shrank year by year as the Earth continued to warm and ice continued to melt. It's estimated this Dogger Island lasted until at least 5000 BCE, giving its inhabitants around 1000 years to develop an entire history, culture, religions, maybe even languages, all its own before finally vanishing beneath the waves. Of course, it's hard to say what an island like this would have been like had it lasted into modern times, and even harder to guess all the different ways it could have affected both European and world history. But I'll be honest, that's like half of the fun of looking at things like this. The only problem is, well, I'm not really an expert at this sort of stuff, and so I decided to ask for the opinion of somebody who is. Alternate History Hub. I guess let's just start with the first one. I wanted to ask you first. You're making your video on Doggerland, like the entire plain, right?
Yeah. So I decided to just do Doggerland at its max extent, and that seemed kind of the wackiest because one, the British Isles are no longer isles, and it kind of connects what we would think of as Britain, France, Germany, and Scandinavia, just kind of all together. So Doggerland would essentially be like a weird melting pot for a bunch of cultures that really would not interact that close by. So yeah, that's why I chose Doggerland. It's most max extent. I forgot what that would date it to.
I think it's 8,000, 9,000 years ago. It's tough because Doggerland was mostly covered by glaciers. So you have to hit that time where the glaciers had receded enough for it to actually be exposed and also for it to still be around,
Yeah, this is one of the things that always happens with, sort of an alternate geography type scenario is how much is changed and how much do you keep? And it kind of fundamentally changes so much that you almost have to kind of not think about it, but also it's an interesting way of thinking about how people and cultures interact, less so of how Doggerland exists. But yeah, I think one, this is going to sound weird, but one fascinating thing I have about Doggerland is the rivers. If it continued to exist, I mean, this is an extension of Europe essentially. And so Doggerland would not just simply be, a bigger Denmark or a bigger UK or whatever. It would have whole alternate cultures that would mix and match along these river valleys that have essentially just, not existed. And so that's something that I had to kind of think about.
All right. So let's change now to just the Dogger Island.
So Dogger Island, I think, is actually kind of funny and cute. I could imagine this easily being a region just, kind of not devastated. It'd be transformed by the Vikings in the medieval age. I can't imagine this would have any previous settlers before the Norsemen.
Well, what's interesting is, because it was connected to the rest of Doggerland, before, in the prehistory, there were actually people who lived here, when it was a real island, there were actual people there. So I think there might have been like a whole other,
culture,
unique culture. Yeah. Indo-Europeans only, came in and changed, the language structure and, everything of Europe, but they might not have made it to this little island. It is so isolated, at least in regards to Britain, which is right next to France. It's like this might have had its own unique thing going on by the time the Vikings got around.
Yeah, you're completely right. That's the strangest thing about the Ice Age for me is that you don't really think about this in terms of people living there and land masses just completely disappearing as anatomically modern humans, existed.
Yeah. So, that's what this whole video,
Yeah. In my mind, I didn't even think about that. I mean, this would be kind of the largest example of what happened with the Bretons or the Welsh or, any pre-Indo-European group, like you said. But it'd be even, to a greater extent because this is a region this is a relatively large island too, that would have no interaction with the Indo-European groups. I mean, it'd just just be kind of a time capsule in a way.
Yeah. Well, until
the Viking, I mean, that would be kind of that's the biggest tragedy. This would be something, if this did exist, we would, if we would be having a conversation like this in the modern day, we would just be talking about how the Vikings kind of replaced these people, or at least intermingled and
overtook them for sure.
But I mean, if they were completely isolated, I mean, that's the thing. It really depends on how much communication there would be with the outside. Would there be even boats that would come and interact with them? I think there would be. So I don't think we would see a Native American type situation, but it might be a smaller version of what we saw happen in England, how you had a pre-Germanic people get taken over by, the Vikings, and then they got taken over by the Anglos, and they got taken over by the Normans. And so you could see this sort of similar situation that happened in Britain happen on, Dogger country, or whatever the people would call it.
And with that, I think I've said just about everything I've wanted to say about Dogger Bank, so let's move on. Now, while in recent years, I feel like Doggerland has become more and more common knowledge, at least here in the geography corner of YouTube, I was surprised to find a very similar and yet far less known case when looking across the Atlantic to the east coast of North America, where we can see that the continental shelf extends much further out to sea than the actual coastline into a feature called the Grand Bank. Adding to the similarities, much of this area was also covered by glaciers just a few thousand years ago. Because ice grows far more easily on land than in open water, the continental shelf also represented the furthest extent glaciers could grow before crumbling off, meaning it was here at the very edge of the shelf that the ice sheet deposited much of the rocky debris it had accumulated along its way to the coast. This had the effect of building up several large moraines, or hills, all along the outskirts of the Grand Banks and down the Scotian Shelf, that were revealed as dry land once the glaciers retreated around 9,000 years ago. In total, 4 big islands, along with a collection of smaller islets, decorated the American coastline for a time. The biggest of these was this one, located on the very edge of the Grand Banks. Because roughly the same amount of material was transported here as to the other islands but was distributed over a wider area, this made this particular island larger but also flatter and lower than the others, meaning that while it may have emerged some 9,000 years ago, the Grand Bank Island was already beneath the ocean by around 8,000 years ago.
Yeah. All right. So let's look at these 4 off the east coast of the U.S. now. These are pretty interesting too. I think each one, it kind of has a different story, I feel, to it. But I think there are 2 in particular that I think have a bit more interesting stories to tell.
Yeah, I think there's one that I see right off of Nova Scotia that I can't imagine it would change too much. It would just be one more interesting aspect. Yeah, I think the 2 that you're talking about are definitely the ones that are right out by the ocean somehow. That's interesting. Yeah. So what's the story with these 2 ranges?
All right. So let me tell you what I've been thinking of. A few years ago, I did a video on who discovered America first or whatever. And one story that I didn't get to include was the theory that there were Basque fishermen who would travel to where this island is, or where the one on all the way in the ocean used to be, and they'd fish those grounds, because these are some of the richest fishing grounds in the whole world, pretty much.
Oh wow!
And people just it's theorized. People don't have proof or anything, but it's thought that there were Europeans fishing there before anyone ever knew that America was there. There's actually a funny story. I forgot who it is now, but some European explorer went over here to, go exploring, I guess. And he found a fleet of Basque fishing ships there already. He was like, well, what the hell? You guys already know about this area? I thought I was discovering it. And they're just like, no, there's tons of cod here, man. That's how we sell it to you guys.
It's like, who cares about, finding a new world and anything like that? We just want fish.
There's so many fish here, man.
Oh man, well,
that's my theory on this, this Grand Bank. It's called the Grand Banks, this Grand Bank Island, where, if there was an island there and, there were Basque fishermen, they probably would have set up shop. They probably would have. And this is like, it's thought of that they were doing it or fishing here around 500 years before Columbus, which is just crazy to think about.
I mean, God, that's fascinating. So that could easily very much be. I don't know if this would, because the Basque is a very low population. I can't imagine the Basque would colonize this entire region, but I could see, you would have some Basque villages and stuff that would like be set up. They wouldn't even know that it's, that far away or that close to a continent. I mean, really, if this island still existed, would even Eric the Red or any Vikings like that have accidentally came across it? And since it's a lot, lower in latitude than the areas they did discover, would they think, oh, this is actually an interesting region to colonize? Because it's not like,
well, actually, it sits, because it's so much further out to sea. It also sits much closer to the Gulf Stream, which would have made it also like a warmer place. If Vikings found it, they probably would have, loved it. And so would have anyone.
I mean, I could imagine medieval people in some way, most likely Vikings or say Basque or whatever. Yeah. You could easily colonize this area and it would probably be very, the type of fauna and stuff that would even live on this region would just be fascinating. Because it's too far away from North America to really, I would imagine, have mammals, but there could be so many weird alternate bird species on this island.
Oh, you know what I just thought of? Wow. Because you said birds, I made a video about the great auk.
Great auk, yeah.
Yeah. And, there would have been no predators. This could have been like their perfect homeland.
Oh God. Now I'm just, okay. You have to include this in the video, or I'll include this or something. I don't know. I know we're not even, this isn't even part of my video, but the national bird just have to be the great auk.
That would be on the coat of arms,
Coat of arms. They survive just as much as the Kiwi is the New Zealand and, whatever. Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll call it Auckland. That's what's
called. That's perfect.
Yeah, it's called Auckland.
Well, it's funny because I was going to say that because those other islands right off Nova Scotia are, right off Nova Scotia, I would call them like New Faroe because of the Faroe Islands. And then
that's great.
Auckland, that's perfect. Like
Auckland.
It's all coming together now.
They sound like they would fit right into Canada too. Yeah, honestly, you just show this map to somebody in the present day and just be like, oh, you've never been to Auckland? You've never been to the New Faroe Islands? And they'll just be so confused. Yeah. And because most people probably aren't spending their time looking at Canada and the map like we are. But
Given its distance from the mainland, as well as its rather short lifespan, I'm pretty doubtful any sizable human populations ever made their way here, and if they did, we're yet to find any evidence of it. The same, however, can't be said about the second largest of these islands, found all the way down here off the coast of Cape Cod, what now forms the feature known as George's Bank. While its shape and size would have changed constantly after its first emergence, given its proximity to the Massachusetts coast, a place that was well populated by this time, I can't help but feel there's a good chance people were living here all the way up to its inevitable plunge into the ocean. When exactly this happened, however, is a lot harder to determine than I initially thought. I couldn't actually find any credible sources giving even an approximation of when the bank finally washed away, although I did find a map from 1813. Here we can clearly see George's Bank labeled, and if we look closer we'll find this little detail right here, what was meant to represent a shoal, or an area of exceedingly shallow water dangerous for ships to sail over. This area is described as being very thick with sand, containing stones as large as a hen's egg, and even several parts of the shoal ground dries at low water with an offshore wind. Or in other words, just a little more than 200 years ago, there were still parts of this bank that could occasionally rise above the water. That's why in satellite pictures like this one, you can still make out George's Bank as the water picks up the sand and silt from its surface, alerting us to the island's presence while simultaneously helping to wash it away.
But all right,
yeah.
here the one that's all the way in the corner. You see it, the lower left-hand corner.
Yeah, that's by Massachusetts?
Yes, that's why I think this is a lot more interesting.
Oh.
So my thought is that like it kind of stands in the way of Massachusetts. So if there were, when the Pilgrims or whoever came over, they would have ran into this island before getting to Massachusetts. They would have had to sail either around it or through it, or they would have just found it and settled there instead of Massachusetts,
I think this would be, I could definitely see this being like a landing ground. This would be like if the British did come and first, try to colonize North America, they would probably try to take this island first, settle this island, and then use it almost like a staging ground to then go and supply other colonies across North America. And so instead of having the 13 colonies, you could have the 14 colonies at first. Imagine there is like a United States, United States Revolution. Yeah. This could probably be the one colony that would actually get away, and it wouldn't actually be a part of what we would think of as the United States, because it is a hub for, the British and fleets and stuff like that. This could be something that the British could easily take and, kind of quell any rebellion within the island, and then use it to try to, launch counter attacks against rebels during the whole revolution. And that would just be either by its choice or I think it would probably be through its choice, because its entire economy would probably rely on that trade between Britain and America, and being that we might have a Labrador and Newfoundland situation where this area would be much more tied to Britain, ironically, than with the rest of Canada. And it could kind of culturally be even more of a blend between British and American than we would even imagine. If there's a place that the transatlantic accent would actually exist in, it would be here.
Transatlantica. There we go. We have our name now.
It's Transatlantica or Atlantica. That's yeah.
What's maybe even crazier than that, however, is what we'll find if we look at the last two large islands left on the shelf's edge, which together with a number of smaller islands formed a nice little archipelago across from Nova Scotia. Although they were both quite small, this also meant much of the debris brought by glaciers was more concentrated here, building these lands up higher than the others. This explains why, if we look at satellite images off the coast of Nova Scotia, we'll actually find this little guy, Sable Island, the very last scrap of these ancient moraines to have survived both the rising sea and erosion from the waves, long enough to make it into the modern day. Though if its size is any indication, it won't be around for much longer. In 1901, the Canadian government planted over 80,000 trees on the island with hopes of combating the erosion that seemed to break down its banks a little more day by day. But by 1927, only a single tree remained alive, assuring that so too will this island one day wash away under the never-ending barrage of ocean water, becoming only the last of many lost islands along America's eastern coast. For our next lost island, we need to look around the other side of the continent and enter the Pacific Ocean for the first time. Here on the west coast, the shelf is far more narrow, meaning there are few opportunities for offshore sandbanks. But if we look closely, we'll find 8 small islands forming the Islas del Canal, or the Channel Islands, off the coast of Southern California. Unlike the islands off the east coast, glaciers never reached this far south, leaving these islands fully exposed even at the height of the last glacial period. In this state, sea levels dropped by over 120 meters, or more than 400 feet lower than they are now, exposing a series of marine terraces around the 4 northern Channel Islands, connecting them into a single landmass called Santa Rosa. Now I know what you're thinking, if parts of this island still remain, then can it really be considered lost? And well, my answer is yes. If the island that once existed was special, but lost what made it special after breaking up into smaller parts. You see, at this time, not only was the Earth's geography different, but so was its biology. Thousands of years ago, North America was home to a variety of megafauna that have since gone extinct. And in case you were wondering, yes, I made a whole video about this as well, which means we should all know the biggest of these North American megafauna was the Columbian mammoth, the largest animal to walk the continent since the dinosaurs. Growing to such a tremendous size, however, required a lot of food, which in turn required vast areas of grasslands for grazing, something that was plentiful here, where rolling plains covered thousands of square miles. But with lowered sea levels, Santa Rosa sat only around 5 miles from the mainland, making it possible for these behemoths to swim here, where they would have found a far more food-limited environment than the one they had left, one that simply could not support such large animals. Of course, as we all know, life finds a way. And so over the next approximately 30,000 years, smaller and smaller mammoths were rewarded with greater levels of success, helping to reduce competition and allowing them to persist and even thrive until a whole new species of pygmy mammoths endemic to only this island evolved. Compared to their 14-foot tall, 20,000-pound mainland brethren, the 6-foot tall, 2,000-pound pygmy mammoths of Santa Rosa wouldn't have even reached up to their tails, and would have looked more like newborn mammoths than full-grown members of a separate species, standing about as tall as a regular human. This phenomenon is called island dwarfism, which, oh yeah, I've actually made quite a few videos on. Unfortunately, just like their larger cousins, these pygmy mammoths are no longer around today, having gone extinct around 13,000 years ago. Now, it's possible that as the glaciers started to retreat and sea levels rose again, the breakup of Santa Rosa into 4 smaller islands reduced the available grazing areas so much that the environment simply could no longer support the mammoths, even at their reduced size. But there's also another explanation. You see, something else that makes Santa Rosa so interesting is that it's here that some of the oldest human fossils in all of the Americas have been found, with the oldest one, the Arlington Springs man, being dated around, you guessed it, 13,000 years, the same time these pygmies disappeared. Considering the humans of the time were capable of hunting even full-sized mammoths, finding an island of tiny mammoths must have been the most exciting day of these Neolithic hunters' lives, and offers another explanation as to what could have caused them to go extinct, especially when considering the species had already survived at least one other interglacial period before the arrival of humans. That's about it for North America, but don't worry, there's plenty more of the Pacific Ocean to explore. In fact, being by far the biggest ocean on Earth, there are actually way too many submerged islands or seamounts to talk about here, and so we'll have to focus only on the most notable of these. Now, I'll be honest, I already covered most of the big underwater plateaus in the Lost Continents video, but there was one that I didn't get a chance to talk about, this one right here that currently supports the Tuamotu atolls. Despite covering an approximately 200,000 square kilometers, only around 850 square kilometers, or 0.4% of it, is actual dry land, and that's on a good day, supporting over 80 atolls or scraps of land held barely above the water by the growth of corals around its base. But 20,000 years ago, with sea levels lower, you guessed it, much more would have emerged as dry land. While this still wasn't enough to unite the entirety of Tuamotu into a single landmass, it did reveal not only a lost island, but an entire lost archipelago. The only problem is the earliest evidence of Polynesian explorers reaching this area comes from at the most 1,000 years ago, long after global sea levels had already begun to rise again, meaning that by the time the first people likely arrived on its shores, this island chain had already been severely reduced in size. But like I said earlier, the floor of the Pacific Ocean is chock full of seamounts, many of which lie just below the surface, and so looking further west, we'll find 2 more loose archipelagos take form, this time much closer to the mainland. Given their proximity to the Asian coast, the first Polynesian explorers departing from Taiwan likely would have reached these shores thousands of years earlier than those of Tuamotu, when far more of them were above the water. And I want you to think about that for a second. The Polynesians were expert navigators. If I had to bet, they likely found all of these islands, establishing colonies, settling villages, coming up with trade routes, all completely unaware that one by one they would begin to disappear beneath the waves. And it's any wonder why the common thread in the story of Polynesians was that they were always leaving their islands in search of new ones. Now, I guess it's possible that these people were leaving the comfort of their tropical island paradises to sail out into the unknown time and time again, likely dying by the thousands, all because they believed there might be more lands out there. Or, hear me out, islands have been disappearing in the Pacific for the entirety of Polynesian history, continuously driving those who settled here off their lands, forced to sail out in hopes of finding another home. If you ask me, I think it's far more likely that this was the true incentive behind the Polynesian exploration efforts. What's really crazy is that I couldn't find any information on archaeological expeditions to most of these lost islands, meaning we can't really know for sure when or where settlements were made. Though if true, then there's likely tons of artifacts sitting atop these seamounts just waiting to be discovered. But okay, if you think that's cool, let me show you something else that I found while looking around the Pacific, the Salas y Gomez Ridge. Similar to the Hawaiian Islands, these were formed as the plate they sit on moved over a weak volcanic hotspot, producing a series of failed islands all in a row. Despite featuring over 110 seamounts, only 2 of these actually breach above the water today, forming the island of Rapa Nui, otherwise known as Easter Island, and Salas y Gomez, a far smaller scrap of rock too puny to support much more than a few ferns and passing seabirds. Back when sea levels were lower, however, we can see many more peaks on this ridge would have risen above the surface, forming a line from Tuamotu straight to South America. Now, considering the earliest estimates for human presence on Rapa Nui place arrival at around 300 CE, with the most accepted date being not until 1200 CE, it's likely the Polynesians never got to witness this island chain. But the earliest settlements along the west coast of South America occurred much earlier, between 6,000 to 8,000 years ago, when far more of these would have been exposed. While these early Americans likely weren't as expert seafarers as the later Polynesians would become, well, they wouldn't have needed to be. Experiments like those conducted by Thor Heyerdahl on his Kon-Tiki expedition proved that even using only primitive materials and techniques, a raft could be fashioned that when set out from early population centers like Peru, the currents and winds could take it as far as the Tuamotu Islands. Knowing this, I can only assume reaching these Salesian Islands from the American coast was not only possible, but probably even easier. Once here, each of these islands could have served as a literal stepping stone to the next, potentially leading ancient Americans all the way to Rapa Nui and beyond thousands of years before the Polynesians. Of course, any evidence of this would likely be buried and sunken hundreds of feet below the water and has yet to be discovered. Though the reason behind this is simple. These are lost islands, ones that very few, even within the scientific community, are aware of. And I seriously think I might be the first person to realize that these were ever even above the water in the past. In turn, this lack of awareness has left these lost islands drastically understudied, despite the amount of interest Rapa Nui receives, and so without launching new expeditions and excavations, we might never get answers on if and when people found these islands before they sank. But it's only by knowing about them in the first place that we can even ask questions like this. And I think that's what makes seeking out sunken islands so fascinating to me, because really, who knows what future exploration might reveal lost and forgotten atop these seamounts just waiting to be found. Okay, and finally, it's time for us to move on from the Pacific to the Indian Ocean. Though I'll be honest, I again already covered the most notable lost lands here in the Lost Continents video, but there's one in particular that I didn't really get a chance to elaborate on as much as I would have liked to. So let's take another look at the continental fragment known as the Mascarene Plateau. Today, the only parts of this shelf not submerged are the Seychelles up here and Mauritius all the way down here. It's in between these two islands, however, where the bulk of the landmass lies, broken into a number of separate banks. At least two of these, the Saya de Malha Bank and the Nazareth Bank, sit high enough to have been at least partially emergent during the last glacial maximum. These would have formed their own separate islands, likely even larger than those that remain dry today, and along with a massively expanded Seychelles, stood as a substantial mid-ocean archipelago. With parts of these banks currently sitting only 8 meters deep, it's estimated that their final peaks became submerged as recently as 6,000 years ago. Despite this, considering the earliest inhabitants of nearby Madagascar came to the island from Australasia only about 2,000 years ago, this leads me to believe that no humans ever managed to reach these lands before they sank. Which means I don't really have a reason to bring them up, but I couldn't help but think of some other forms of life that might have made their way here. Call me speculative biology hub. Specifically, not that long ago, yes, I made a video, this time about the dodos that made the nearby island of Mauritius home. Here, the plentiful supply of food and lack of any large predators allowed dodos to evolve much larger than their pigeon ancestors. This trend is called island gigantism and also resulted in the Rodriguez solitaire, the Réunion ibis, and even the tremendous elephant bird of Madagascar, all within the same general area. Knowing this, we can only assume a similar evolutionary path was taken by whatever birds found their way to these islands as well, potentially producing their very own unique species of giant birds.
I think, what I see here is I see like a circle. I see this very interesting region that could be its own like cultural sphere, its own trade network, because I can tell you're probably going to talk about how Madagascar is settled by not Africans, but by Southeast Asians.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. So these Southeast Asians would already have settled, what's it called?
Seychelles. There's like,
sorry. So these Southeast Asians would have already settled Seychelles and Cargados and Rodriguez and stuff like that. And obviously they have different names. But this would be a place where it'd be a seafaring people that would mostly trade with each other. But then Madagascar would kind of be the outer regions of this cultural area. And honestly, I don't think the people would ever give up their seafaring nature. I mean, because if they crossed all the way from the Indian Ocean into Madagascar, it would be almost like an Indian Ocean version of Polynesians. Yeah, a smaller version of that. But I mean, we're talking that'd be a very fascinating alternate culture to kind of imagine, as any island nation would. And then each, these islands are big enough. Okay, so basically that difference from Mauritius to Seychelles would be from Maine to southern Georgia. Yeah, this is so this would be, even if they are culturally similar and they would trade, which I could imagine, Polynesian style, but each island would be its own unique culture, viewing itself as its own nation. It'd be definitely, the Europeans.
Yeah,
that's something I didn't think. I was so fascinated on the people themselves. I didn't think about colonialism.
Neither did most people.
Yeah, no, it was very unexpected. But yeah, I think once the Europeans would come, this would be probably immediately settled by at least the Dutch. But this would be the stopping ground, going under the Cape of Good Hope and stopping off in these islands.
Probably the Portuguese too, right? Like
probably the Portuguese. Honestly, these would probably be some wild islands. These would be, I could imagine poor Amirante. That could be like the freaking Vegas of the Indian Ocean. You'd have traders. You could even have like a mix of the even pirate. You have Somalia, like only a little bit further north. This would be the Caribbean of East Africa. And it would be crazy. You'd have pirates, you'd have traders, you'd have Portuguese and Dutch ships with the biggest targets on them back. But it would also be a rest area where they could trade and, socialize and stuff like that. And it'd kind of just be this crazy time during the colonialism, I would tell you that. Well, because it'd be like, this would already be an area that I could imagine having its own, 1,000 years of civilization in a way.
Yeah.
This would be something that they would have not only trading amongst each other, but they would be trading with East Africa. I mean, this transformed.
Oh, there'd be, there'd be Arab traders. Arabs
there'd be Arab traders. This would be, this place would be bopping. That's what I'm talking. This would be just the strangest blend of. It would most likely already be. It'd be Muslim already, but God, I could imagine it would definitely be a strange area once the Europeans came and colonized it.
I'm trying to think of who colonized Madagascar.
The French.
The French,
but the French wouldn't. I don't imagine the French would not have. This would be either Portuguese or Dutch, because that would be the main people coming under and trading with the Indies. In fact, this would probably be the most lucrative. This would be the golden gem of the Portuguese Empire. This would be the absolute thing that they would want to protect more than anything, because they would just trade through. They would already have control of a lot of West Africa, or at least have bases on West Africa, and then they would trade under South Africa, and then this would be the most important place to protect, because then they could project power into India and trade with India. So whoever, this would be the center of so many alternate 16th and 18th century wars. It'd be insane. This would be something that would make the Caribbean look like nothing. All the wars, all the piracy of the Caribbeans, it would look like nothing compared to this.
And they'd all have their own big birds too. It'd be,
and they'd all have their own they have some really nice fossils, I'll tell you that.
Though, as is the case with most of these, little to no archaeological work has been conducted on these banks, thanks to how difficult these areas can be to access, leaving the specifics of their peculiar flora and fauna up to our imaginations for the time being. But at the very least, we know they wouldn't have looked like anywhere else on Earth. In fact, the same can really be said about all of the islands we've looked at today, but by hunting these places down, we get one step closer to understanding the role lost islands have played in our own history, which, now I have a whole video on too. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. Special thanks to Cody from Alternate History Hub for coming on and giving his thoughts on some of these. If you want to know how Doggerland might have affected history, make sure to check out his video. The link will be somewhere on screen. If you haven't already, also make sure to check out my video on Earth's lost continents. Also, I'm still trying to make it to 1 million subscribers, so if you feel like this video earned it, you know what to do. Of course, if you'd like to see more videos like this, you can help support the channel through my Patreon. And trust me, I know there are tons of other islands I could have mentioned, so if you know of any good ones that I could put into a follow-up video, be sure to tell me about it in the comments. Lastly, like the video, you know it helps, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.